angel passed away, but some days it feels like the weight of it still crushes me. I loved her deeply, even though life had a way of putting me in the background while my sister Margaret took center stage. My name is Rebecca, 27 years old, a painter who scrapes by with small commissions. I'm not the kind of person who craves attention, but sometimes I wonder if that's why Mom always seemed to gravitate toward Margaret instead of me. Margaret seemed to have everything: a husband, a nice house, and the luxury of never having to take responsibility for anything. Mom adored her, always defending her no matter what. Meanwhile, I was the one making sure things didn't completely fall apart. "Why are you always so dramatic, Rebecca?" Margaret scoffed one day as I helped Mom pack her things to move into the small house on Margaret's property. She was feeling sick lately, and we thought it would be better if she lived closer to one of us. "It's not like I'm doing nothing. I'm giving her a roof over her head, aren't I?" I clenched my jaw, trying to stay calm. "She's not some stranger, Margaret. She's our mom, and that roof is a guest house you haven't used in years. Also, she's paying rent. You're not giving her anything." She rolled her eyes and crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway. "Do you know how many people would kill for a setup like this? She's lucky to have me." "Lucky?" The word came out like a laugh, bitter and sharp. "You mean lucky that I'm here handling everything while you take the credit?" Margaret just shrugged and walked off toward her house, leaving me standing there with a mix of anger and disbelief. It was always like this, her doing the bare minimum and acting like she was a saint for it. Later that evening, we got the results. I called Margaret to fill her in. "Margaret, it's bad," I said, my voice trembling. "It's lymphoma. The doctor said 6 months to a year." There was a pause on the other end before she finally responded, her tone annoyingly flat. "Well, that sucks, but at least she has her little house here. That's something, right?" I blinked, gripping the phone tighter. "That's all you have to say? That sucks?" "She's dying, Margaret. Dying." "What do you want me to do, Rebecca?" she snapped. "Drop everything and become her private nurse? I have a life too, you know." "You could start by showing some basic compassion," I shot back. "Maybe take her to a doctor's appointment once in a while or spend some actual time with her." She sighed loudly. "Look, I'm doing what I can. Let's not make this about you, okay?" I hung up after that. There was no point in arguing. Margaret would always find a way to turn things around and make herself the victim. After Mom got sick and started treatment, she became too weak and tired to manage her personal finances. Since I was the one taking care of her day-to-day needs, Margaret had taken over handling her bank account and bills. I didn't love the idea, but Mom trusted Margaret, so I let it go. I thought, maybe for once, Margaret would step up and actually do the right thing. One day, Mom asked me to check her bank account balance for her. She'd been worried about some upcoming expenses and wanted to be sure she had enough. "Rebecca, could you stop by the bank for me?" she asked, her voice frail but warm. "I just want to make sure everything's in order." "Of course, Mom," I said, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "I'll handle it." I went to the bank that afternoon, still thinking everything would be fine. But when the teller handed me the account summary, my heart dropped. Her account was almost empty. The savings she had worked so hard to build after selling her car, gone. And then I saw it, one massive withdrawal made a few weeks earlier. The name on the transaction hit me like a punch to the gut: Margaret Bennett. I stared at the slip of paper, my hands trembling. There had to be some mistake. Margaret wouldn't. No, she couldn't. But the evidence was right in front of me. I stepped outside the bank, the cold air hitting my face like a slap, and I called Margaret immediately. "What's up?" she answered casually, as if we hadn't been through months of hell. "Are you serious?" I said, my voice shaking. "Margaret, why the hell did you withdraw all of Mom's money?" There was a pause before she answered, her tone defensive. "Rebecca, calm down. It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" I snapped. "Her account is empty, Margaret. Empty. And there's a transaction for the full amount, with your name on it." She sighed, like I was the one making a big deal out of nothing. It's a loan, okay? I needed the money for some unexpected repairs. I was going to put it back in a few months. Mom doesn't even know. It's not like she needs it right now. A loan? I almost laughed, the bitterness choking in my throat. You think you can just borrow every last penny she has without asking her? Without telling anyone? She's sick, Margaret. That money wasn't yours to take. Don't be so dramatic, Rebecca, she said, her voice sharp now. I'll pay it back. I always planned to. You're blowing this way out of proportion. You've got to be kidding me, I said, my voice low and shaking. Mom is dying, and you think this is about me being dramatic? You're disgusting, Margaret. I could feel my hands shaking as I gripped the phone tighter, trying to steady my voice. You have no idea what this has done, do you? Mom asked me to check because she was worried about paying for her groceries, Margaret. Groceries. Do you understand how humiliating it's going to be for her if she finds out? She won't find out, Margaret snapped, because you're not going to tell her. My stomach twisted at the sheer audacity of her tone. Why the hell wouldn't I? She deserves to know what you've done. Because it'll only stress her out. Margaret cut me off, her voice sharp and condescending. Do you really think she needs that right now? She's already dealing with enough. Besides, I'll put the money back before she even notices. You're always acting like I'm the bad guy here, Rebecca. But I'm trying to handle everything the best I can. Handle everything? I practically shouted, the anger boiling over. You mean dumping all the hard parts on me while you play the perfect daughter? Don't you dare act like you're the one making sacrifices. Rebecca, she hissed, her voice dropping. If you care about Mom, you'll let this go. She doesn't need to know about this. And you, stop trying to make me the villain just because you can't stand that she trusted me with her finances. I hung up, unable to listen to another word. My chest felt tight, my heart pounding as I stood there on the sidewalk, staring at the cars passing by. Margaret was trying to spin this into something noble, as if she was doing Mom some kind of favor by stealing from her. But what could I do? Telling Mom would break her heart, and the thought of adding to her pain made me feel sick. I needed to talk to someone, to vent, to make sense of the storm brewing in my head. Without thinking twice, I called my best friend Laura. She picked up on the second ring. Hey, Rebecca, how are you? She asked, her voice warm but slightly concerned. She could always tell when something was wrong. It's Margaret, I said, my voice cracking. I told her everything. The bank account, the withdrawal, the pathetic excuse Margaret had given me. By the time I finished, I could hear Laura's breathing had quickened. She took everything? Laura asked, disbelief dripping from her voice. And she expects you to just keep quiet about it? She said it's a loan, I said bitterly, pacing my small living room. She's acting like she's doing Mom a favor by not telling her. Laura didn't respond right away, and when she did, her voice was low and firm. Rebecca, you can't let her get away with this. What if she doesn't pay it back? Your mom needs that money. She's depending on you. I know, I said, running a hand through my hair. But if I tell Mom, it'll crush her, and Margaret knows that. She's using it against me. Of course she is, Laura said sharply. She knows you're too kind to blow this up, and she's taking advantage of that. But Rebecca, someone has to hold her accountable. I sighed heavily, sinking into the couch. I don't even know how. Margaret doesn't listen to me. She never has. And George, her husband, always so full of himself. I stopped myself, but Laura jumped in. George knows about this, doesn't he? She asked. He has to. Probably, I admitted. He's just as bad as she is, always backing her up no matter what. You should have seen how smug they were when Mom moved into that guest house. Like they were saints for letting her live there. You're not alone in this, Laura said gently. I'll help however I can. But Rebecca, you need to stand your ground. Her words gave me a small flicker of strength, but I still felt trapped. I couldn't tell Mom. I couldn't confront Margaret without it escalating into a full-blown war. But I couldn't just sit there and let her walk all over us. The next few days were unbearable. I couldn't get the thought of Margaret's betrayal out of my head. Every time I saw Mom, it was like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. She'd smile at me, thank me for helping her with dinner or sitting with her during treatments, completely unaware of what Margaret had done. I couldn't bring myself to tell her. Every time I opened my mouth, the words got stuck in my throat. But Margaret didn't make it easy to let things go. A few days later, I was at Mom's house, helping her organize her medical bills, when Margaret strolled in like she owned the place. George was with her, carrying a few grocery bags that he plopped on the counter without so much as a word to either of us. "Look at this," Margaret said, holding up a small bouquet of flowers she'd clearly just picked up from the store. "I thought these might brighten up the place. Don't you think, Mom?" "Oh, Margaret, that's so thoughtful," Mom said, her face lighting up. I bit my tongue so hard I thought I might draw blood. "Thoughtful?" "She emptied your bank account, Mom." But instead, I just nodded stiffly, pretending to focus on the papers in front of me. George caught my expression and smirked. "You should learn a thing or two from Margaret, Rebecca. She's always thinking of others." It was the last straw. I slammed the papers down on the table and stood up. "Thinking of others? Are you serious?" My voice was shaking, but I didn't care. "Rebecca," Mom said softly, looking startled. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I muttered, forcing myself to calm down. "I just remembered something I need to take care of." I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, unable to stay in the same room as Margaret and George for another second. As I walked out, I heard Margaret's voice behind me, low and mocking. "She's always so dramatic." The next day, I needed to clear my head, so I decided to run a few errands in town. I was walking down Main Street, juggling a grocery list in my head, when I saw her. Margaret, stepping out of one of the fanciest boutiques in town, laughing and chatting with a sales assistant as George held the door open for her. She had at least 3 shopping bags in her hands, each with the store's logo plastered all over them. I froze mid-step, my stomach churning. There she was, spending God knows how much money on clothes and who knows what else, while Mom was budgeting for groceries. The image of Margaret's name on that withdrawal flashed in my mind, and my hands clenched into fists. Without thinking, I marched straight up to her. "Margaret," I called, my voice sharp and loud enough to make her flinch. She turned, her smile fading as she saw me. "Oh, Rebecca," she said, her tone saccharine and fake. "What a surprise! Out shopping too." "Shopping?" I hissed, glaring at the bags in her hands. "What are you even doing here? Spending more of Mom's money?" Her face tightened, but she quickly recovered, flashing a tight smile. "Don't be ridiculous. This is my money. George and I work hard, Rebecca. Not that you'd understand." George snorted beside her, clearly amused by her jab. "Careful, Rebecca," he said smugly. "Jealousy doesn't suit you." "Jealous?" I laughed bitterly. "No, Margaret, I'm not jealous. I'm disgusted. You drained Mom's account, and now you're out here buying designer clothes like nothing happened. How do you sleep at night?" Margaret's expression hardened. She stepped closer, her voice low and venomous. "I told you it's a loan. And if you care about Mom, you'll drop it. Do you want her to know about this? To worry about something she doesn't need to?" I stared at her, my chest heaving with anger. "You're unbelievable. Mom deserves to know the truth. She deserves better than you." Margaret leaned in closer, her voice dripping with venom. "You tell her and you'll break her heart. She's already sick, Rebecca. Do you really want to be the reason she gets worse? Think about that before you open your mouth." As I stood there, fuming at Margaret's audacity, a wave of memories hit me. This wasn't the first time Margaret had pulled something like this, and deep down, I knew it wouldn't be the last. Mom, bless her sweet heart, had always been Margaret's biggest defender, no matter how awful her behavior was. When we were kids, Margaret had a knack for pushing every limit. She'd borrow money from Mom's purse for things she needed, like concert tickets or new shoes. Mom would find out eventually, of course, but she'd just shake her head and say, "Oh, Margaret, you should have just asked." And that was it. No punishment, no accountability, just forgiveness on a silver platter. Even as we got older, nothing changed. Margaret always had an excuse, always a sob story to back her actions. There was the time she borrowed Mom's car without permission and wrecked it. She cried and blamed a pothole, and somehow Mom ended up comforting her, saying, "Cars can be fixed, but you can't replace family." I remember sitting there, stunned, while Margaret smiled through her crocodile tears. Mom had a heart too big for her own good. She always believed the best in people, especially in Margaret. "She's your sister, Rebecca," Mom would say whenever I tried to bring up Margaret's behavior. "She's not perfect, but she means well." I hated that phrase. She means well. It was Mom's way of justifying everything Margaret did, from lying to taking advantage of her kindness. But this time was different. This wasn't a harmless mistake or a moment of bad judgment. This was calculated, cruel, and completely unforgivable. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that, if Mom knew, she'd find a way to forgive her anyway. That was who Mom was. A sweet, selfless person who couldn't see the bad in the people she loved. Margaret and George had always measured people by one thing: money. To them, a person's worth was directly tied to their bank account. If you weren't wealthy, you simply didn't matter. I'd seen them brush off neighbors, coworkers, even distant relatives who didn't fit their idea of successful. There was this one time when Mom invited Mrs. Hathaway, an elderly widow from down the street, over for tea. She'd been a kind woman, always bringing baked goods and little gifts for Mom. But when Margaret and George stopped by and saw her sitting there in her worn-out cardigan, Margaret barely acknowledged her presence. George didn't even bother hiding his disdain. Later, Margaret pulled me aside and said, "Why does Mom even talk to people like that? What can they possibly offer her?" It was sickening. And the irony of it all? Their own so-called success was as fragile as glass. Beneath the surface, George and Margaret were drowning in debt. They'd been borrowing money from the bank for years, refinancing their home, maxing out credit cards, whatever it took to keep up appearances. Margaret once let it slip to me after a few too many glasses of wine that they were stretched thin, but she quickly laughed it off, saying, "It's just temporary. George's investments will pay off soon." But they never did. That's the thing about people like Margaret and George. They live for the image, the illusion of wealth, even when it's built on lies. Their fancy cars, their designer clothes, their perfectly manicured lawn. It was all for show. And now, seeing Margaret use Mom's money to keep that illusion alive made me feel sick to my stomach. Mom, who had worked so hard to save every penny after selling her car, deserved so much better than to have her sacrifices thrown away on Margaret's shallow lifestyle. Mom's decline was slow at first. Small things like losing her appetite or needing more rest. But as the months went by, it became harder to ignore. Her energy faded, her voice grew weaker, and some days, it was like the vibrant woman I'd always known was slipping away right before my eyes. I tried to be strong for her, but the weight of everything, taking care of her, managing my own life, and the constant frustration with Margaret, was becoming unbearable. One day, after another tense encounter with Margaret, Laura suggested I try something to clear my head. "Rebecca, you're burning out," she said gently. "You're doing everything for everyone, and it's not sustainable. Take a couple of hours for yourself. Go to that yoga class you've been talking about." I hesitated, but finally agreed. Mom was having a quiet day, and Margaret was supposed to be around, so I thought, just this once I could step away. I left my phone on silent in my bag, telling myself it would only be for a little while. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe, even if it was just for an hour or two. When the class ended, I grabbed my phone and saw the missed calls, 6 from Margaret. My stomach dropped as I fumbled to unlock the screen. Her last voicemail made my blood run cold. "Rebecca, it's Mom," Margaret's voice said, trembling but sharp. "She's gone. I don't know where you were, but you should have been here." I don't even remember how I got home. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled into the house where Margaret was sitting on the couch, her face red and blotchy. "She just stopped breathing," she said, looking up at me. "I was here, but there was nothing I could do." I couldn't speak. My heart felt like it had been ripped out of my chest. I'd been gone for 2 hours, and I hadn't been there to say goodbye. Mom had died at home, in the little guest house she'd moved into with Margaret by her side. The guilt hit me like a freight train. "You should have been here," Margaret said, her voice cold now. "I don't know why you thought yoga was more important than Mom. She needed you, Rebecca." Her words sliced through me. I wanted to scream, to tell her that she had no right to judge me, not after everything she'd done. But I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, tears streaming down my face as the weight of losing Mom settled in. The day of Mom's funeral was cold and gray, the kind of weather that seeped into your bones. Mom had been deeply religious, so it was only fitting that the service was held at her beloved church. The stained glass windows cast soft colors onto the pews as the organ played a somber melody. I sat near the front, clutching a tissue in one hand and a picture of Mom in the other. My heart was heavy, not just with grief, but with the weight of everything that had happened. Margaret and George arrived late, of course, sweeping into the church as if it were a fashion show. Margaret was dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure, her neck adorned with a pearl necklace that probably cost more than my monthly rent. George, in an expensive-looking suit, walked beside her, carrying an air of smug self-importance. The way they moved, it was like they thought the funeral was about them, not Mom. As they made their way to the front, I caught the whispers. People were glancing at me with judgment in their eyes, leaning toward each other to murmur behind their hands. My stomach twisted, and I tried to focus on the picture of Mom in my lap, but it was impossible not to hear. "Rebecca wasn't even there when Angel passed," one voice whispered. "Margaret said she was off doing yoga," another added, the disdain dripping from their words. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. Margaret had made sure to plant that seed in everyone's mind. She wanted them to see me as the selfish daughter, the one who abandoned Mom when she needed me most. And judging by the looks I was getting, it had worked. Margaret slid into the pew next to me, flashing me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You okay, Rebecca?" she whispered, her tone dripping with faux concern. "I know it must be hard, knowing you weren't there for her." I stared straight ahead, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a response. The priest began to speak, his voice filling the church as he talked about Mom's kindness, her unwavering faith, and her love for her family. I felt tears sting my eyes as he mentioned how devoted she had been to her daughters. If only he knew the truth. As the priest continued his eulogy, his voice grew softer, more intimate, as if he were speaking directly to each of us. "Angel was a remarkable woman," he said, glancing at the congregation. "She loved deeply, forgave endlessly, and carried a quiet strength that inspired those around her. In my final visit with her just days before her passing, she entrusted me with something very personal. A letter." A murmur rippled through the church. My breath hitched. A letter? I glanced at Margaret, who shifted uncomfortably in her seat. George furrowed his brow, looking confused but not concerned. I, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of curiosity and dread. "She asked me to read it today," the priest continued, holding up a sealed envelope. "It was her final wish, and she made me promise that I would share her words with all of you." The church fell silent. You could have heard a pin drop as he carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside. The anticipation was unbearable. My heart pounded as the priest adjusted his glasses and began to read aloud. "To everyone gathered here today," he began, his voice steady, "I want to thank you for coming to celebrate my life. I lived a life of love and faith, and though it was not without challenges, I leave this world with gratitude in my heart. However, there is something I must say before I rest, something that weighs heavily on me and must be brought into the light." I froze. I could feel the tension in the room as everyone leaned in, waiting for what came next. "I have always believed in forgiveness," the priest read, his tone solemn, "but forgiveness does not erase the truth. And the truth is, in my final months, I experienced a betrayal so painful that it nearly broke me. Margaret, my eldest daughter, I trusted you with everything. My care, my home, my finances. But you took advantage of that trust in ways that no mother should ever endure. Gasps echoed through the church. Margaret's face went pale, and she shifted in her seat, her hands gripping the edge of the pew. George's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, his eyes darting toward the priest. You took the money I had saved from selling my car, money I had set aside for my care, for emergencies. Rebecca, who gave so much of herself to ensure I was never alone, I know that you knew about this, but decided to protect me so that I wouldn't suffer in my final months. God bless you for being such a wonderful child, the priest continued. Margaret, you drained my bank account and what was left of my energy, leaving me with nothing. I knew, but I kept quiet. I didn't want to shame you or cause more pain in my final days, but people need to know who you are. My hands flew to my mouth as tears streamed down my face. She knew. All this time, Mom knew. The guilt, the fear of breaking her heart, it had been for nothing. She had carried that pain herself, silently. The priest's words lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. The silence in the church was deafening. All eyes turned to Margaret, who sat frozen, her face pale as if all the blood had drained from it. George shifted uncomfortably beside her, his usual smugness replaced with unease. No one said a word, but the weight of judgment in the room was palpable. I didn't move. My tears were flowing freely now, but they weren't just for Mom. They were for the truth she had carried alone, for the strength it must have taken to leave this world with grace despite everything Margaret had done. My chest ached with a mix of grief, relief, and rage. Margaret finally broke the silence. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her voice trembling with indignation. She was sick, probably confused. I did everything for her, everything. And this is how she repays me? People around her started to whisper, their faces filled with shock and disdain. George grabbed her arm, trying to pull her back down, but she yanked it away. "You don't know what it's like," she continued, her voice louder now, almost desperate. "I was under so much pressure. I needed that money for the house, for both of us." "That's enough, Margaret," the priest said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is not the time to justify your actions. Your mother's words speak for themselves." Margaret glared at him, then at me. Her eyes burned with a mix of anger and humiliation. "I hope you're happy," she spat before storming out of the church, George trailing awkwardly behind her. The sound of the heavy doors slamming shut echoed through the sanctuary. I sat there, stunned, as people began to murmur around me. Some whispered words of sympathy, while others exchanged looks that said everything they thought about Margaret's outburst. Laura, who had been sitting a few rows behind me, came up and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Rebecca," she said softly, her voice steady, "your mom saw you for who you are. She knew you were the one who stood by her, no matter what." I nodded, my throat tight. Mom's letter had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I had spent so much time protecting her, trying to shield her from the truth, and yet she had known all along. And even in her final days, she had chosen to protect me instead. As the service ended and people began to file out, many stopped to offer me condolences, their words laced with a newfound respect. Margaret's mask had finally slipped, and the truth was out. I wasn't sure what would happen next, for her, for George, or for me. But one thing was certain. Mom's voice, even in death, had given me a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. That night, as I sat alone in my small apartment, I looked at the picture of Mom I had taken from the service. "Thank you," I whispered, clutching it close to my chest. For the first time in months, I felt the faintest glimmer of peace. Mom's love had been bigger than Margaret's betrayal, and in the end, that love was all I needed to carry me forward.